Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Claudia Pollack. I'm the marketing and community coordinator here at Ephemera. And joining me today, we have Peter Molick, who is a photographer, an architect. Would you call yourself an architect?
No, I'm an ex-architect. I'm an architectural photographer by
Yes.
trade.
Yeah, so photographer with definitely architect influence for sure. So we are joined by Peter today, and we're going to be talking about Peter's work crossings here on Ephemera. So Peter Molick is a photographer and artist based in Texas. Trained as an architect, he returned to a lifelong passion for photography with a focused vision and an ability to create works that translate three-dimensional spaces into two-dimensional medium with a graphically straightforward result. His personal work strives to explore the nature of the built and natural environments and how they are perceived differently in the digital space. All right, so welcome, Peter.
Thanks for having me.
For sure. Okay, so I just wanted to get started off with the question that I like to ask any photographer, and that's how did you get into photography?
Yeah, photography has just sort of been a long passion of mine. I didn't study it formally. I was always sort of in and out of art schools growing up and took several photography classes in that time. My dad was kind of a serious hobbyist, so we had a dark room growing up throughout most of my like teens and formative years. And then going to architecture school was sort of my like practical choice of education outside of the arts because I didn't really know where the arts would lead me, and it sort of fit the logical side of my brain. So I practiced architecture for about 7 years, and in that time really started taking photography more and more seriously, and like honing my skills and my eye, gearing it more towards architecture in the built environment. So I started shooting some projects for friends and colleagues, and then just sort of chipping away at my skill set and future client base, sort of, and then once I really felt that I was there, I made the jump from architecture to architectural photography, and I've been doing that for about 7 years now, full time.
That's awesome. So it kind of seems like you started out photography as like a bit of a hobby. It was kind of around you growing up and then moved on to commercial work. And then now I guess you're doing photography more as a hobby again. Is that right?
Yeah, well, so I mean, yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it. Because it's hard, I'm a full-time photographer. So I'm shooting constantly for clients. So then the personal work sort of comes and goes in fits and spells, depending on, that like creative drive. It's funny because as you start doing something that is a hobby or in a passion full-time for work, that like desire and drive to make things on your own time sort of ebbs and flows depending on how busy you are as a commercial professional. So anyways, it sort of comes in waves. I still, anytime I go on vacation, particularly like outdoor vacations in nature, I'm always can't put the camera down and love to like shoot things in an uncontrolled environment. So yeah.
Yeah, totally. It's interesting working as, I mean, I've done a bit of commercial photography here and there myself, and it's interesting kind of seeing how different the work is commercially versus making it for yourself, on the outside of work. So it's interesting to see that contrast. So I wanted to ask you a bit about crossings here. So this is what we're looking at right now is Peter's page on Ephemera, and this is the crossing series. So it is a series of about 25 images, all looking at Houston. And you can see they feel very much like copy, paste, and they're looking at the different kind of infrastructure in Houston there. So Peter, I wanted to ask you if you could just talk a little bit about the concept for crossings here and how that came to be.
Sure. So I'll back up a little bit before the project. I had gotten introduced to the early world of drones as DJI was first producing like consumer drones, and I'd always had this fascination with aerial photography, and I always had this like desire to shoot from above, you know, and obviously just never had the means or the resources to do so. But I remember when I was in architecture school, I picked up a book by Jan Archus Bertrand. It was called, I think, Earth from Above, and it's just like all these amazing sort of abstract photos from above, looking at various landscapes from around the world. And so that had sort of given me the itch for doing aerial photography. So anyway, I got the drone, and I had been doing a lot of like cityscape photography at the time, just sort of trying to hone my architectural skills in my off time from architecture, and so shooting from like a lot of rooftops and things like that here in downtown Houston, where I live. And then of course the drone just sort of like allowed me then to do that kind of imagery from an unrestricted sort of unrestricted places where I didn't have to have a building to stand on or anything like that, which was really fascinating. But it wasn't really, I wasn't like doing anything that was, breaking any barriers or showing something that people weren't doing it elsewhere, So eventually I sort of found this way of looking at the city where I was like, I had always wanted, I've always been fascinated by like Becker and Becker's work of like creating some sort of typological view that can be tiled together and shown like as a that's something that's greater as a whole than the sum of its parts. So somehow somewhere in there I discovered this template where I would shoot everything centered directly above an intersection at like a fixed elevation 300 feet above that intersection at the time, and it was sort of like a block square. At least in Houston, it was like the city square block view of this intersection. And then I realized as I started like taking more of these that you could sort of tile them together at random and create this like quilted view of a city that sort of describes its aesthetic and its the pluses and minuses of like urbanism and of a certain city. So it just sort of evolved over time, and it was at a time where I was really involved in Instagram and my like social media drive or whatever, and it got a lot of attention on there. And it was just really fun to just like go out and explore and try to find different intersections. I would like compile Google Maps and think about intersections that, especially with the Houston one, it was like these, I wanted it to just be these like perfect Cartesian grid intersections where it was like straight lines, nothing, no curved intersections, no like larger or smaller roads, which fortunately Houston's sort of homogenous in that way. So it just sort of made sense.
Yeah, and I can definitely see the Becker and Becker influence there. So I'm very familiar with the water towers work that they did. And so seeing this series for the first time on ephemera without even reading the description or the influence, I made that connection right away. And I think that the work is very successful in the way that there's like a formula, there's a framework for it, and they're all very similar in their execution. And I love hearing you talk about the fact that you had to, was it 300 meters that you had to fly the drone?
It was 300 feet, yeah. Our restricted access is like 400 feet above, but I just sort of found it because that was where it matched up with the adjoining intersections on either corner of the frame. It just happened to be like this perfect height for the view.
Yeah, and did you find that when you were flying the drone to capture these intersections, did you have to do a lot of post work afterwards, like cropping them or maybe overlaying them to make sure they were like exactly the same?
Not really at all. I mean, the drones allow, although this was like a very early time in drones when I really started this, and it was, they weren't quite as precise as they used to be, but there was like, you turn on like your grid lines to be able to sort of see that you are centered. And just use some compositional tricks to get things centered. And then I might have to do like a little bit of skewing in post-production just in case it was like angled one way or the other. But it was actually pretty simple. And then obviously cropping it to the square format was a given. But the post-production was pretty limited in this, I would say.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear. And you mentioned that you started this work pretty early on. So when did this all start?
Yeah, so it probably started in like 2014. So I mean, I think I had like, if people are familiar with DJI's product, it was like the DJI Vision 1 or 2 or whatever it was. And it's interesting, I just sort of slowly did it for a couple of years, really. And I wrapped up the Houston series specifically in 2016, and I was invited to show the work in Venice which led to doing a sort of sister series or similar series in Venice, Italy, which we can talk about. But I, yeah, it was just this sort of like slow, you know, anytime I would get free time and it was a decent enough day to go out to shoot, that I would do it. And just like, I mean, this series will have 25 images total, but the I can't remember how many I had in the end. There was probably like 70 different intersections that I had. Some of them are just really unattractive or just didn't really fit well with, and I would always try to catch like interesting things happening on the ground. Like there's a lot of buses that show up in this, and cars like crossing through the intersection, which give it a little bit of life, because you're at such a scale that you're not going to see people walking by with any sort of detail. So you just sort of hover up there and wait for something interesting to pass by and try to catch it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I noticed I did take a look at the Venice series as well, and the contrast between the two is very interesting. They look, completely different if you're looking at each image individually, but as grids, they look very, very good together. Like they're both kind of, trying to. There's a commentary of a similar nature, and so you said that you had about 70 images that you shot for this. What was the selection process like afterwards? Like did you sit down and look at all these images and try to figure out which ones would fit into a grid of 25, or did you have like a number already planned that you wanted to have for the series?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I had anything specific planned, but I did sort of play with it a lot. At some point I had come up with a 6x6 grid, and it starts to just feel like a little too much, and I really love seeing them all compiled together. And as the opportunity to show the work in Venice came up, I had really had to start thinking about actually showing them together, which is a pretty daunting task with 25 images and then eventually 50 images. But so 5x5 just sort of made sense. It was nice to have like a central one in the middle, so that odd number worked out well. And then the sort of culling process was just trying to find like a good variety that showed, like, don't select all the most beautiful images, but select ones that just like show the diversity of the landscape of downtown Houston. These are all taken in Houston's like central business district. So, but yeah, just trying to show the diversity of that. And there was a strategy to do. If you look at on my website, I have the 5x5 grid sort of, so it lays out as 5x5 at the right aspect ratio. But I did lay out that we have a light rail going down Main Street, which kind of cuts through the center of downtown. And I did take like intersections that included the light rail and cut them across diagonally from top left to bottom right, which just kind of was an interesting anchor. And then similarly in the Venice series, I had in Venice, the concept of the intersections was bridges crossing over canals. And of course, those canals are of like a great variety of scale. So that central axis is the Grand Canal in the Venice series, and the way that I laid them out. But the great thing about it is you can just like, if I had it programmed into, if it was like a program thing and you can hit randomize, it would just randomize it into another grid and it would still make sense.
Yeah. So I'm going to pull up your website just so we can give our viewers here a bit of a visualization of the two series. So this is Crossings right here. We're just on Peter's website. And then if we scroll down, this is the Venice series, which we were just talking about. And I want to pull up this image here. This is really interesting. So this is part of the exhibition that you had in Venice?
Yeah. This was a big group exhibition called Time, Space, Existence, which is an exhibition put on by a group called the European Cultural Council. And this was during the Venice Architectural Biennale.
Yeah, this is wonderful. As soon as I saw how these grids worked in this space, it's just amazing. Like the presentation, I just love following the different lines, especially when we look at like Crossings, the Houston work on the left here. Just following those lines diagonally, you can just follow them through the entire grid and it all lines up so perfectly. And I thought that was just amazing work.
Yeah, thank you. And it was really exciting to see, obviously, because I had sort of had this image in my head of how they could look, all put together. And the interesting thing is that the group that put this exhibition together was kind enough to to help with the printing and framing in Venice. So
Mhm.
I hadn't actually seen the work all put together until I showed up there. And it was just, like couldn't have been more excited to walk into this amazing room in this in this Palazzo with this, everything just done exactly how I'd imagined.
Yeah, that's incredible that they were able to help you out with that. Usually it's like, galleries internationally will expect the work to be shipped over, but it was great that that was able to happen.
Yeah, there's a lot of negotiating back and forth, but
Yeah.
they're an amazing group of people, and really helped me out.
Awesome. So I wanted to ask, so we have both Houston and Venice here. Have you ever considered maybe expanding this work to include more locations?
I definitely have, and around this time, when I had gotten this opportunity to go to Venice, I had also connected with a gallery here, Barbara Davis Gallery, and she showed the work sort of in tandem with it being shown out there. And she encouraged me to take part in Photo Fest Biennale, which is a biannual event here in Houston, which is kind of amazing for photography, where curators and gallerists and collectors come and do portfolio reviews, and several other things happen during that time. So I did that. It was my first sort of portfolio review that I've ever done. And the big thing that I talked about was that I had this like grand vision for going to different cities of all types, of all scales. I had this vision of going to like desert cities where they're like dirt roads, and going to, cities maybe in the Arctic where it was like snow covered roads. And everybody was very excited about that, including myself. The tricky thing is that right around that time, 2016, 2017, drone laws have really gotten a lot more strict. And I also have just become more sensitive to trying to follow the rules. At the time that I was shooting this one, particularly the one in Houston, both of
Mhm.
them, in fact, there weren't really any rules in place that were, um, now it's the rules around shooting above people, above cars, close to buildings, things like that are very based on city to city and country to country. So, I have a hesitancy where I don't want to like, I was shooting in Venice was a really good example of what I'm getting at. It's just like, I don't want to be a nuisance to a place that's foreign to me. It already feels like you are flying when you're flying a drone anywhere. It's sort of, is that way. So that I'm just very conscious of the legality of it. And I think I wouldn't do it without jumping through more hoops and making sure that it was, the people knew what I was doing, sort of. But I would
Yeah.
love to have like a series of 50 cities or something like that. The other challenge will be my professional career is sort of very busy these days, so it's a hard thing to
Yeah. Yeah,
to
totally. Um,
imagine doing.
so with all these drone laws kind of expanding and we're seeing more and more of them pop up, would you have been able to shoot this Houston series if you were to shoot it today, or do you think that there are now some restrictions in these areas that you have shot?
I mean, you can still shoot in most parts of like a downtown area as long as the city doesn't have full on restrictions, but there are uh, some, probably not as well defined as they should be, but there are still some restrictions as far as like flying above any traffic technically is a no-no. I mean, sort of, I think everybody does it to some extent because, it's just not flying above traffic is nearly impossible in a lot of ways, because then, you're flying above a park basically, or above I don't know, a building that you have permission to fly above. So, and same thing with people. Like if there's people crossing underneath, you're not supposed to fly above them unless, at least in the States, unless the people are notified about it. So I don't
Mhm.
know, maybe we would post signs down on the ground at the intersection that we were flying at. But so yeah, I don't know. And to be fair, I'm not as up to the current laws as I should be, but I've sort of started flying less commercially than I normally would, also just because there's other people that'll do it for less cost, and I can sort of art direct people now to do that. But
Mhm.
yeah, I don't, it's a good question. And the thing in Venice, you certainly can't avoid flying over people. Venice was just it was really just kind of a terrifying experience in general. The seagulls were the seagulls in Venice are known for being really aggressive, and they were like nose diving towards my drone, and I was just so terrified. I already felt like an intruder coming to this ancient city, this amazing city where there's the only motorized vehicles are boats, and flying this noisy drone above history, and not even speaking the language. Anyway, there was I had a lot of feelings about it, but so yeah, it's hard to know what the right thing would be. I mean, even if it is legal, but I really do think it's like such an interesting idea that can take on so many lives. I had another or a sort of congruent conversation during those portfolio reviews about doing several different, and I still might do this, doing several different series of it in Houston, and instead of being a dialogue about a city sort of in one quick glance, doing it in more impoverished areas and then in more well-off areas. Some people that I know here that are involved in some advocacy groups that advocate for equality in urban living have recently been posting this interesting aerial view that shows this diagonal road that we have in the southwest part of Houston, and on one side of it, it's like completely tree covered and green, and it's residential area that has a high percentage of shade trees, big oak trees. And then on the other side of this road, it's like almost all paved. There's hardly any trees. It's still residential, but also with commercial. And their statistic was talking about how on the shaded side, it's I think like 9 degrees cooler than on the non-shaded side, and it's this like inequity of our living situation. So it'd be interesting to sort of take on a better cause and do this for like a higher purpose or something, and try to show like these differences that exist within the same city for different demographics and stuff.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Like I'm even thinking like gentrified areas, or there's so much there that you could explore. And I think it would be a wonderful visual to create in terms of that commentary. Yeah. So moving on, I just wanted to ask you before we kind of move on to some questions here. This is something that I was curious about. So in deciding kind of, as artists in this NFT space, what work do we mint as NFTs? What was it about Crossings and Houston in particular? What was it about this work that you wanted to mint on the blockchain?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I'm constantly trying to understand where we as photographers fit within the NFT space in general. I think, I mean, based on the response that I get whenever I share this to my like greater photography and architectural community, I think there's, we're all sort of thinking about this. I think photography's always had an interesting place in the art market, where we have this responsibility to control our available outputs, right? Like it's not uncommon to make things available at various size and at various scales and edition sizes. So I'm still sort of trying to understand this. I think though that I thought a series like this that sort of can be interconnected and sort of tiled together and collected independently as an interesting image, but is much more interesting as a whole, is an interesting thing to sort of own a piece of. And as I've gotten deeper into the collecting of NFTs, I think it's interesting that you can own one thing, but you can still be part of a larger collection that you can look at more easily than you could if it was a physical piece, right? I think I look at like Justin Aversano's work with his Twin Flames project, and Alejandro Cartagena in his 50 Carpoolers project, which both of those I've been aware of for a while. The 50 Carpoolers one I've been aware of for quite a while, and I've seen in person, and it has like this huge impact where you're looking down on these trucks passing under overpasses with people like sleeping in the back of them and things like that. And when you see them compiled as this like large grid, similar to that installation shot of mine, it has this like really amazing impact. So for me personally with the Crossings project, although I showed it a pretty great state on a pretty great stage. It hasn't really sold much as a physical work, and it's because I think that there's that disconnect where if you just buy one or even four or however many of these, it doesn't have the same impact as the whole, and it doesn't have the same connection to the other pieces that other people might buy because they're physical works in different locations. Whereas with the digital space, these things can sort of all live as their whole online, and then you can own your own piece of that and know that you're sort of own a part of that puzzle. So it just sort of made sense to me, and I've been really excited to see some of these other photographers' work being presented in this way. I think it just makes sense, especially as something that might not have been as successful from a collector's point of view as a physical. This seems to be a good space for it. So.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, like when I look at Crossings, the nature of the work, it feels very collectible and it's very identifiable, right? So if I were to see like one of these in a collector's collection, I would automatically know and identify that it is part of like a bigger collection because I've seen these before, you know? And I think that there's, especially as photographers in this space, there's a lot of room for kind of like collectible photo series. And I'm curious to kind of see that grow and expand, much like, you know, Justin's success with Twin Flames. And yeah, so I think that this is a great work to have up in the NFT space because of those reasons. Okay, so I wanted to just move on. We have a question here from Gino. So thanks for sharing your experience, Peter. Quick question. Is it possible and advisable to offer a physical original together with our NFTs?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I might not be the best person to answer it, and you might be able to help me with that. But I think it's totally possible. Where I get a little tripped up is understanding the accountability aspect of that, right? Like, it's easy to be accountable for the transfer of a digital, the digital ownership of a piece, but that physical component, there's certainly some sort of trust-based mechanism that has to be involved. But I think it's a really fun aspect of this world, is to be able to offer sort of the two in congruence with one another. It's something I thought about with this one. Is it would have been interesting, which it's too late now really, but to offer the grid of 25 by 25 on a smaller format, which is like a really fun thing to have for each person who owns it, or for each person who owns any one of the pieces. But yeah, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Claudia? I'd love to hear.
Yeah, it's interesting because I hear different opinions in the space all the time. But what I like to go back to is with the purchase of the NFT, like the collector is buying the token and that's it. You know, it's not any copyright or commercial rights unless specified so, right? And so I think that ultimately it comes down to just a conversation between artist and collector. So one thing that I find a lot of photographers, including myself in the space, do is they reach out to the collector who has bought the NFT afterwards and they go, hey, would you like a print of this work, you know, just to represent the NFT? And the print isn't, you know, directly attached or connected in any way to the NFT, but it's just a nice little physical, almost like thank you, or way to just like represent that NFT that they can have, you know, that's tangible. And so ultimately, I think it just comes down to opening up that conversation with your collector and that trust factor, and then understanding, you know, the boundaries of that transaction and kind of, you know, what it is that you've purchased and what it is that, you know, you're willing to offer as like a thank you or like an add-on or something to the NFT. And that's how I like to think about it. You know, it's just, it comes down to that dialogue at the end of the day.
I think that's a great point. And I think one of the reasons that's such an important thing to have that dialogue and conversation is that there's a huge secondary market with NFTs that doesn't exist as much, at least not as openly with the traditional art world. So there is an expectation from some collectors, maybe if it's not well defined, that they receive that physical thing that might have been tied to the NFT, and that's where there really becomes some true trust concerns that someone might, you know, it's so easy to passively sell something online and then to send, you know, both for privacy concerns and logistically and all this stuff, to if it's, you know, what happens with that physical thing
Mm.
beyond that. I'm pretty involved. We were talking about art blocks before we jumped on here, but I'm pretty involved with a generative platform called art blocks, and a lot of artists on there offer print sales of the pieces that they mint, as a sort of secondary thing. And there's been this conversation about what happens if you add a print of that piece, because they're usually just a one-of-one print that's offered. It's not like
Mm.
every owner in for the depth, for forever, can obtain a print. So that there's this stipulation that if you buy a print and then you sell the NFT, that you like also send the print. And I just think that's a big ask and a complicated endeavor.
Yeah, and it's also hard to kind of keep track of and manage, I would
Yeah,
imagine.
absolutely. And what if it gets damaged in transit? Even if you were doing that, if it gets damaged in transition or something, then both people are out of that print.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, lots of conversations to be had in this space for sure. And I see threads about this on Twitter like every day about physical prints and copyright and commercial rights. And so it's kind of just like learning every day, just taking it one step at a time. Okay, and Gino says thank you very much for your reply. Okay, so we're nearing the end of our time here. So I just wanted to say thank you everyone so much for tuning in today. Thank you, Peter, so much for joining me today. I absolutely loved this time with you and just talking about your work. And yeah, I'm learning more and more about photography and urban planning every day. And so that's very exciting.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, well, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure to talk to you and hear some of your thoughts on this stuff too. I mean, it's great. I really appreciate the platform that you guys are putting forth and look forward to seeing it grow and evolve over time for sure.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. All right. So have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Likewise. Thanks, guys.
Bye.